Welcome to a Cisco meeting. You are entering the meeting now. This meeting is being recorded. You are the only participant.
Do you have some scissors I could borrow? I don't know if I have any up here. I know I have some downstairs.
Yes.
Gotta come introduce myself before we get inundated. My name is Ruth Braga. I'm the nurse educator here. So Maggie, yeah, Maggie and Kathy are my inspiration. So you are the reason I have a job.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you. Yeah, as you can see, I got here early.
I'm going to make some comments about nurse educators.
Are you?
Most places have never heard of them.
I know.
That's all
Yeah.
about nurse educators.
Yeah.
It's pretty much the traditional role.
Well,
Medical student, resident.
I'm mostly resident actually. And I've done some with, I just do orientation with the med students and then I kind of help out with the surgery interest groups. But I'm department, so I do plastics and, I don't know if you know Mendenhall from SA. Yeah, so he's another, I'm so excited because he's gonna be a moving force
Yeah,
here.
I looked through the roster of faculty. Surprised I have no idea who's here.
Yeah.
Good.
Oh,
So
he's
Ruth
wonderful.
Braga.
Yes.
And do you do standardized patients? Do you do ICU with them?
No, we do trauma-based simulation.
Okay.
They don't do SPs with the residents at all.
Okay.
They do some with the med school, but that's been an interesting dynamic too.
Are you the first nurse educator?
Yeah, I'm the only department that has them.
Okay. When did you start?
7 years.
Now you're a PhD educator.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and they're trying to hire staff because I've been the sole person that's doing skills lab, and that's starting to be picked up by OB and other departments. So.
Steve Power, nurse educator. Well, so nice to meet you.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to see you on our agenda and.
Well, Bridget's been a real inspiration across the country. She and my program director are both in the same master's program.
Okay.
That's how they got to know each other.
Oh.
Probably how this happened. So.
Well, in San Diego, I was listening to your keynote, and you said the first thing you need to do is get yourself a nurse educator.
Was that the AFC?
Yeah.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
first one I'm talking about this morning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can
Oh.
skip it. You've already heard most of it.
No, that was a wonderful,
Yeah,
wonderful talk.
when I consult, during the week I was consulting, there were two clerkship directors, and one for UCSF and one for USC. So I told them, "Look, you can do a lot of this stuff, but it's not going to happen until you get it."
Well, and it's done for you to do it. Yeah.
It's not enough of you.
And I'll tell you, I would have been a better nurse. I've almost thought about branching out into doing some education for nurses without physicians. Because I knew only about 2% of what their life is like when I was working as a nurse. And I've told all of them, I'm sorry, I could have helped you so much more when I was a nurse.
Yeah.
You know? So,
You see yourself doing this for a long time?
I hope so. I hope so. I hope they'll
You
keep
have a
me.
master's in education.
Yeah, I'm an MSN from,
PhD.
no, I did surf, and that actually convinced me that I don't want to do a PhD.
Okay.
So I
Did you
think I
get to
would.
know Maura Sullivan?
Uh-huh.
Maura was my
Well,
nurse
and
educator at
Laura
USC.
Torbeck
Yes.
is she was my mentor.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Maura came as a nurse educator from USC. The experience was so phenomenal for the students. We had an extra $1 million in students. What should have extended? They said, we wanted Maura Sullivan on every clerkship. And that was the first university to have nurse educators on every clerkship.
Oh,
Maura,
my
of course,
goodness.
wanted to get a
Yeah.
PhD, took my job when I left. So.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming out.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
excited that Utah has one.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't know how much it helps. From time to time, I feel like more of an annoyance, but it's wonderful to be here. How are you doing? I'm good. Are you in this workshop?
I'm not actually a second year medical student. Every once in a while. Well, usually I had like an open invitation. I attended the plastic surgery program, and so this week I was told that. I am very interested in surgery, but
Are we in our usual prep center?
Satellite view from over here.
He's so funny. He's like crusty this morning. So funny.
It was great. We had a lot of, she was so tired. Yeah, I was just
good.
like,
You know, I was like early. She was like, I can't even get back to
she's so sleepy. She just like went to bed. She's so cute. Yeah. I said she has a like once when she went back to switch back to she initially talked to us, but she never would just fold the
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, how are you? Depends what you're on. If you're a surgery, something there.
That's hard. There's like a small area.
Or is it?
We installed it. So when you carve the door, yeah, as long as you have a steel door, like it's it comes with something you can tape on there, and then it's like you come on the line and just shove it in. It's it's like two people around. Not really. Yeah, it's a little bit. But what I like about it is that we're lost. Yeah. So like, if you in the yard, it's pretty good. I could just lack about your phone. No, it's a button on the door. You just lack about your phone. Yeah. That's the reason JD likes it. I'm like, no, you're. That's a good area. It's nice because you're watching more fun. Okay, quick run. I wish there's a way. You know what? So like open up to see the door open, let your dog out. That's a good idea. So you don't come back in and lock it in. It probably doesn't. It's stupid expensive. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Although, yeah, someone's the same thing. So, I mean, yeah. She was not having it. She was like, I'm scared. I think she's like, I don't think I'm gonna fit. She's like, I'm gonna fit. And I'm like, just has to fit. She's waiting for you. Like, you can fit, don't worry. Sometimes I think if you push her together, you can drag her through it, and then she like gets through it the first time. She's like, oh, I see. Same thing with a car, like if you're going in the right, or just shove her through it. She's like, oh, it's fine. And I got it. Okay. I'll have that be good for your life. I could eventually see that. It's just no, I mean he likes food, but it's more like he picks and chooses. So like I tried to positive reinforcement train him, and like if he would see a bunch of beer, and I could have steak in it, or he was just gone. But, so once we did the e-collar, that was like. I think a lot of it is just stacking the matter. Once you're eating, it's like you just, even if it's just like a beef stack. Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. I was a different person. They actually like make that face, like, huh? Yeah. Where was I? Right. So it's not like I don't even nibble. It's just like. I was like, she's like, not. She likes steaks, but she's not picky. And I was like, Carrie, you know what? She was like, legit, just lay down and like drag her up. Let's keep going. They make one eater for that, like a bug and bird, where they like their 4 paws go in and then it's like a bird. I'm like, I always thought she kind of just like pack one in just in case he like slips off his paraphrasing. Right.
You do it so well.
So you operate retired.
Yes.
Then I heard. It's terrifying, right? Yeah, it sounds exactly like oh yeah, it like, that's what happened. Okay, well, it's I should be, I don't know, so maybe like offer it for a second. Just depends on like, so just, okay, well, just Thursday, you know. Andrew and I both wake up. Yeah, so it's like, I would check, hopefully they won't let me offer those.
They want everybody to
No, that's why we find it.
Okay, everybody, I apologize for the delay. There are some technical issues, and as you can see, we can't get the screen down, can't get the projector going. Turns out that there's nobody in Huntsman South Auditorium, so we are going to go there. So if you don't know where that is, just follow the crowd. It's the next building over. Usually takes place.
You grew in hair? Full bag?
Oh yeah.
You sure did. Good. How's you?
And so I was like,
Yeah, good.
Hey, Brian.
I'll see you around.
Yeah, you like.
In the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, apologize for the delay. Because of the delay in starting, we're actually going to run this 10 or 15 minutes after the hour. If you have some fixed obligation that can't wait, Dr. Dunnington will be understanding if you have to slip out as quietly as possible. But hopefully everybody has enough leeway to stick around a little longer. This is our education grand rounds, an event that we look forward to every year. Bridget was gracious enough to identify an outstanding speaker for us today, Dr. Dunnington, and I will give the mic to her to give the formal introduction.
Thank you, Sam. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Dunnington. As you might expect, his accolades are long, and I could waste 5 to 10 minutes of his speaking time filling you in on all the wonderful educational accomplishments that he has had over his career. But I will try to be brief. Dr. Gary Dunnington is someone who I have known through his presence in the surgical education literature for more than 10 years, really just starting with my interest in education. And he's the chair at Professor and Chair of Surgery at Indiana University School of Medicine, where he also received his MD degree, so he is back as the chair of his now alma mater. And I'm going to skip to his educational accomplishments just in light of the reason he's speaking with us today, despite his other many clinical accomplishments. He has served as clerkship director, program director, director of Surgical Skills Center, vice chair of education, as well as senior associate dean for academic affairs at various institutions over his career, so he really has seen education from every perspective. He's received a total of 19 institutional teaching awards and also a distinguished teaching award from the American Association of Medical Colleges, the AAMC, so excellent national recognition. Has been a past president of our Association for Surgical Education and received a Distinguished Educator Award from that institution, and has also served as a visiting professor at over 70 medical schools in North America for education-related visiting professorships. So we're happy to add one more to that list and have him here today. And on a personal note, I will say that I interviewed with Dr. Dunnington for a job at one time in my career, and I remember him asking me why I didn't have any teaching awards listed on my resume. And that sticks with me because I suspect he asks that of everyone that he recruits, and I think that may speak to the topic of of his presentation today, building education culture, the flywheel effect. Thank you, Dr. Dunnington.
That was not the reason you didn't take the job. I'd forgotten about that question, but you're right, I do ask that from everyone. It's a privilege to be here. I've known faculty from the University of Utah for a very long time, dating back to Merrill Dayton, who some of you may remember, and then over the years, Lee Niemeyer, and David Bowl, and Amelia Cochran, and a number of others. So it's really a privilege to be here and get to know some of the folks here. I'm talking today about surgical education culture. And let me give this disclosure, no pharmaceutical disclosures, but to just be clear that I've probably learned more over the last 35 years from the mistakes I've made than I have the successes. My purpose today is to help you avoid some of those same mistakes. Context is really important here. When I describe the culture, it's important to understand what the context is. And one of the reasons I came to Indiana as the chair was because it was so complicated. It's one of the most challenging environments just because of its sheer size. Our faculty and residents rotate through these 8 metro hospitals, with 5 of them on the medical center campus with 2 level 1 trauma centers. We're right at about 130 faculty. Our medical school is even more complicated. It's the largest medical school in America at 360 students a year, but they rotate in 9 regional campuses. So being a clerkship director at IU is a tough job. It's a 50% of their time, and they have to spend time in all 9 of these regional campuses, all associated with a major university. So there's a campus at Notre Dame, and Indiana University, and Purdue University, sharing those basic science faculty. So that's the context of which I'm speaking this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these areas, some key traits of great culture, some change literature. So even if you're here and not really interested in surgical education, there's going to be some great principles if you're trying to affect any kind of change in an organization. Some of the vital behaviors, I'm going to come back to that term, it's so critical in trying to change an organization. And then talk about measuring and improving the performance of teaching. When we think of great culture, these companies seem to come to mind, and there are a few things that are unique about them. One is their employees are passionate about their company. We'll come back to that. They also have become quite remarkable with very little advertising. So there's some of those aspects. If you ask for a definition, I think this one by Herb Kellner is probably the best. Culture is what people do when no one is looking. That has great implication as we think of surgical education culture. Now, there are two ways you can change organizational culture. You can do it top down, or you can do it from the bottom up. The first part of my career, I was doing it from the bottom up. It's a lot easier from the top down, but I want to encourage those of you who are new faculty that it is absolutely possible from the bottom up. And just for a minute, I want to talk to just residents and faculty perhaps in their first 5 years. So the rest of you can tune out for a minute. Because I want to tell you how my career began, because it's important to understand why I feel as I do about surgical education. I started my career at the University of Arizona as a clerkship director. Unwisely, they gave me the job on my first day as a new faculty member. Those were the days where the person that got the job was the brand new faculty who didn't seem to have anything else to do and showed at least a modicum of interest. But I was told you must have a basic science lab if you're going to be a successful academic surgeon. So I began studying multiple organ failure in rats. And after about 6 months, my real passion was education and education research. So I went to my chair at the VA where I was, and I said, I'd like to close my lab and be an educational researcher. I'll never forget his response. He just began laughing and said, well, that's a crazy idea. No one does that. That's a dead-end career. No promotion, no tenure. Being a good young surgeon, I went back to my lab, killed a few more hundred rats over the next several months, hated it even more than the first 6 months, and finally I went back to his office for a second visit and said, I really am closing my lab, and that's okay if I'm an assistant professor for the rest of my career. I really want to do educational research. Not only did he give me a really difficult time, but about 4 other faculty brought me into their offices and told me how I was destroying my career. I want to assure you that's not the response you'll get at the University of Utah. If you come to your chair or your vice chair and say, I think I want a career in surgical education. But in those days, it was rather novel. The Association of Surgical Education had about 70 folks that attended nationally. But it has been a remarkable career. I had to find a couple PhDs to teach me how to do educational research, and then partnered with Deb DeRosa, who many of you know. And so you have to make this decision, but I think a career in surgical education is an absolutely phenomenal experience. I would encourage all of you to consider this. Back to culture. Important book written a few years ago that looked at those cultures that are really outstanding, trying to figure out what it is that makes them so outstanding. Think of these characteristics because they really apply to what we're doing. Here are some of the characteristics of those organizations. Employee compensation and benefits are far greater. More time for employee training. That's a big issue for changing culture. They hire for passion for company and products. Vernon Hill, the chair of Commerce Bank, tells his new employees, this is a cult. And if you don't buy into this, you've probably chosen the wrong place to work. That sort of passion. High levels of integrity and transparency. Those two together can be quite frightening. Tapscott and Tacoli wrote a book a few years ago called The Naked Corporation and made the comment that if you're going to be naked, you had better be buff. Think of that as it relates to both integrity and transparency. Customers will pay a high price for high sold, and they all challenge industry dogma. Well, those are absolutely the characteristics of an innovating educational culture. I'll base the talk on this theory because it really helps as I think about how to change a culture. And it's really this from Jonathan Haidt called the Happy Index. But it's really the thought that change involves 3 parts. The writer is that analytical side of us, the logical side of us. Show me the map to change. The elephant is that emotional side, just the natural way of doing things without even thinking. And the path is how you get there. And as you think of change, if you ignore any one of these, you do so at your peril. An elephant weighs 6 tons. They're going to win every time. If you fail to take into consideration the emotional aspect of changing an organization. There's been very little written on this. One of the first was this publication in the fall of last year that looked for the first time at surgery training culture and study of over 7,000 residents at 260 programs. And the culture was best defined as wellness and negative exposures. No one yet knows who these 26 programs are. All of us want to hope we're not one of them. But these are the kinds of things that characterize those programs in the bottom of the list for surgical resident culture. Now, as you know, the second project is underway, a national prospective randomized trial. I'm not sure whether you're participating. We are randomized to the intervention trial. So we'll be doing interventions around wellness to see how that works out over the next few years to change educational culture. I want to give you my schema. This isn't published anywhere. It's just sort of as I've thought of culture change and learned lessons over the years, this is how I think about changing the culture. This is exactly the pattern that I followed when I came to Indiana University in 2012 and made efforts to change the culture. The first is to learn the present culture. You do so at your peril if you just barge in and try to change culture, because you can't change it like buying a new car. You have to identify the strengths of the culture. Who are those people that when they speak, everybody listens? You have to get those folks on board. And you may want to be sure some things are very clear that you don't want to change in the culture. Those are valuable things to preserve. So the very first thing is obviously raise the bar. So when I arrived at Indiana University, I took a few months to decide where are the greatest opportunities to really improve the educational culture. And I'll give you some of the things that we looked at. One of the big opportunities was surgical simulation. I remember when I was interviewing, they wouldn't show me the skills lab for the first two visits. That was a bad sign, a red flag. Finally, they showed me a little room about the size of a, is that ringing terribly? I'm not sure how to put it in that. Maybe turn off this feedback. Is that better? Finally, they showed me the skills lab. There was a little room about the size of a bedroom in the animal facility. I asked where the virtual reality equipment was, and they said, well, we had one 4 or 5 years ago, but it's broken. I had a few out-of-repair box trainers. So we had a lot of opportunity to start. So we created a new 1,600 square foot surgical skills laboratory. We still use the live animal surgery, maybe 25% of our skills curriculum. And we have a 35,000 square foot, it's almost like a simulated hospital where we do all of our team-based training. So this is our skills lab. It was designed specifically to accommodate our boot camp of interns, which is 28 interns from all surgical specialties. It's a 13-week program. So that's how it was sized. So we do models here. We do all of our cadaver training here with 2 full-time staff. This is the simulated operating room where we do team-based training. And I think increasingly that's a really important part of surgical training. This picture, I think, speaks 1,000 words for those who say, you know, this simulated training really isn't very realistic. Residents don't take it seriously. Look at the sweat on the brow of that tall guy. If you think he's not taking this simulation experience seriously, and our residents certainly do. This was just a few days ago, led by Nikki Lee, who runs our skills laboratory program. And we do it multidisciplinary. There were surgery and EM interns, trauma nurses, emergency medicine faculty, simulation fellows, our own faculty, mostly from trauma critical care, our surgical education research staff. So it's a tremendous experience helping them to work cross-professional standard, and it's a wonderful experience, especially the debriefing opportunity. The other thing we introduced the arrival of Dimitri Stepanidis, our Vice Chair of Education, is he brought with him a man by the name of Nick Anton. When Dimitri first said to me as I was recruiting him, I would like to bring my sports psychologist with me, it clearly caused me to raise an eyebrow, and I just said, tell me more. I didn't realize what a tremendous addition a sports psychologist would be to a skills program. He's taken all the lessons learned of training elite athletes and helped us train elite surgical trainees. And one of his most important contributions is this mental skills curriculum, which all of our residents go through. And we have good data showing it improves performance in the operating room and stress management, fewer errors, shorter time to completion of an operating event. So it's a dramatic curriculum. We've now actually included medical students in this training, and we're looking at NIH funding to help us take this to teams in the operating room, training in mental skills for an operative event. This is clearly one of the most ambitious projects we've tackled, and that is to change the whole model of residency training. My mentor said to me over 30 years ago, wouldn't it be great in this country if someday residents graduated, not because it was July 1, but because they actually proved they were competent. Well, that's the 5-year project we're on, trying to go up this scale and make sure that our graduating residents are competent, not just the right number of cases in defined categories. And as you know, we have used numbers as a surrogate for competency in this country for decades. That's what determines if you're ready to take the board exam. And instead, we're looking at a single bar of competency, and all residents must achieve it, regardless of how long that takes. This isn't a new concept. Flight training has been using it for decades, so we have a lot to learn from that experience. This is just one sample of our first model. We started with something simple like laparoscopic cholecystectomy. It's a second-year rotation, entirely competency-based. So residents begin with a lot of the cognitive aspects, the SCORE modules, the SAGES, laparoscopic cholecystectomy. They pass all of those modules, then they move on to the simulation and tasks. They have to pass all of those tests, then they're handed a beeper. And for the rest of that month, they just do lap chole after lap chole after lap chole, with 12 of our surgeons who have agreed to teach it in the same way. We're looking at that data, and I'll just show you one aspect of the data that proves pretty impressive. This is the percentage of residents that attain the critical view of safety during an operation, all assessed by video. In the standard curriculum, 71% of the time. I think that's probably pretty typical. In this competency-based curriculum, it's 100% of the time. So this is just some of the data that's starting to accumulate that convinces us, as we were pretty certain before, this is a far superior way to train. Well, why haven't more folks done it? Well, here's the reason. Based on the experience of orthopedics at the University of Toronto, the only place in North America that this is done, and it's now in their 9th year. It's expensive. It's a dramatic increase in assessment. Lots of increased faculty time. We've hired a full-time IT person to build the IT platform, and a significant increase in faculty development as they're spending a lot more time assessing resident performance. This is just one of the things as we start to add things to the curriculum en route to this 5-year goal. This is our Chief Resident Assessment Day, happened just a few days ago. Residents then, with a pig and a live animal laboratory with an intern as a first assistant, perform these 5 procedures with a faculty assessor. We're not allowed to give any hints or suggestions as much as I would have liked to. We just have to watch them do the operation and then assess their performance. If they fail this, they have to repeat that performance. It takes them about 3 hours to perform these 5 basic procedures. So as one of the ways, we're basing it on direct observation, not numbers as a surrogate for competency. Many of you are probably familiar with Simple. I'm not sure if it's used in this program. This was really a creation of our research team and the research team at Northwestern. When we said that they're using the Swish scale, looking at autonomy as a surrogate for operating performance in the operating room, we were using a very complicated 10-item checklist, which faculty compliance was low for. And we put our teams together and created Simple, which is an app-based 3-click system that is used in many programs across the country. So it combines the two, and every time I finish an operation, I say to the resident, be sure to send me a Simple. They then evaluate their own performance, how much autonomy they believe I gave them, and the difficulty of the case, which triggers a bright red spot on my Simple app, and I evaluate the same 3 things. We're working on compliance, and I'll come back to how we're helping in that regard. But it really allows, perhaps for the first time in this country, to be able to tell a resident, you're at the 23rd percentile in operating performance with other second-year residents across the country, similar to ABSITE. And that was our goal when we started down this road about 12 years ago. We ultimately want to get to this. This has not yet been published, but is submitted to Annals of Surgery. For about 18 years, my research assistant was Reed Williams. Reed Williams was a PhD educator who I believe knew more about assessment than anyone in the world. This was his last project before about 1.5 years ago he died unexpectedly. But this is what we were working on at the time, a system for evaluating competency before residents graduate. So we said we're going to take those procedures that are high frequency, 20, that's all there are, that residents perform more than 10 times. So we're going to specifically ask competency in those areas, practice ready is the highest level, and they must have autonomy in those areas. Minimum of 32 observations. This is all based on data from Reed and I at SIU. And you have to have at least 7 raters to get rid of rater idiosyncrasy. And then for those other procedures, it's aggregated assessments. And this is how we will determine a resident's ready to graduate from the program. It may take 3.5 years, it may take 6. Now, I want to be clear, we have not yet petitioned the American Board of Surgery or the RRC. They all know we're doing it. Sometime in the next 12 months, we will need to make that formal plea. We're hoping to complete this now in about 4 years. So we've clearly raised the bar. Now, how do we get folks on board? This is one of the steps that I've often noticed people forget. This week I was consulting with 2 clerkship directors, one from UCSF and one from USC, and asked them about their expectations for teaching. And there was a sort of a blank stare. We were talking over Skype, and they said, well, we really don't have any of those. And I suspect it was much like in Indiana when I arrived. There was a core of about 8 to 10 people that did everything. If they weren't at the skills lab, it didn't open. And the rest felt somewhat excused because, after all, I'm a researcher or I'm a busy clinician. That's not a sustainable model for teaching excellence or a really strong educational culture. So we really developed these 2 documents, Teaching Expectations. It's about 18 items for resident teaching and 9 for medical student teaching. And everybody is expected to do that. As we say at IU, if you get a red check, that's everybody, you must participate in the teaching experience. And with 130 faculty, it's not a large burden on anyone with those expectations. We tell every single faculty recruit about these. It's attached to their employment agreement, and it's included in discussions and expectations. Now, let me mention something that I think is important, and I don't know exactly where things are at Utah, but one of the things I've done is I've traveled around the country as a visiting professor. I was talking last night at dinner. There are two things that in my mind are barometers of an educational culture. The first question I ask the clerkship director or the chair is, where does your clerkship stand with regard to medical students? Whether it's graduation questionnaire data or when they graduate, how they award the clerkship's excellence. And the other is your M&M conference. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of that perhaps this morning. I think those are really two good barometers. Well, here's where we started in Indiana. This was Craig Brader, the dean who recruited me. In our first dinner, when I asked him, where does surgery clerkship stand? And Craig said, I'm really sorry about that. But for as long as I can remember, and he had been dean for 12 years, so I knew it was a long record, surgery is always tied for last with OBGYN. Now, I will be first to say that is not so uncommon. I can tell you how many places I've been. Those two procedural specialties are at the bottom of the list. Now, you can make a lot of reasons or excuses as why that's the case, but we had a burning platform. A burning platform is that emotional part of change. So I constantly stood in front of our faculty and reminded them, many of them were not even aware of this. Did you know this clerkship is the worst in the School of Medicine and has been for as long as we can see the records? And is that what we want to be as a department? There were one or two that said we're fine with that, but most of them said, well, that's a little embarrassing. We should change that. And so we set up on a 3-year plan. And this is just a sample of probably what I think were the most impactful things we did. The first is, end of every clerkship for 1 year, I and the clerkship director sat face-to-face with the medical students. We told them what we were trying to achieve and asked them clearly, you tell us what's wrong with our clerkship and how do we make it a better learning experience. I can tell you the number of things I learned from those face-to-face encounters that I never learned looking at the written feedback. All faculty and residents had to be engaged. If you had 80% of the residents engaged, it doesn't work. It only takes a couple of residents to make a really bad experience for students and faculty. Residents as teachers, every single year had to have a module. We dramatically increased the amount of simulation. The more we did it, the more students said, give us more, less lecture, more simulation. Probably one of the most impactful was that every single one of our teaching hospitals, one faculty member is assigned for professor rounds every week. No business, no patient care, pure teaching. The face time that students desperately want in their clerkship. Clear expectations for student performance, and we hired a nurse educator. That was new. We had to explain what that was. I was so delighted this morning to meet Ruth. You're a nurse educator. You're one of a handful of programs around the country that realize the importance of a nurse educator. I've had a nurse educator since about 3 months after I took that first clerkship job at the University of Arizona. And if people ask me what's the one thing you can do to make the biggest impact to change the quality of the clerkship, it's a nurse educator. They're like a physician extender. All those things you wish faculty had time to do, but never will. That's what a nurse educator does. So simulation. Not sure we can do all the simulation we do without a nurse educator. From all 9 campuses, they come at the beginning of the clerkship and low-stakes simulation. At the end of the clerkship, they return to the campus for another full day of high-stakes simulation. And our nurse educator plays a significant role with all of these typical surgical scenarios. This is just a sample, and I don't need to educate you. At most places, people aren't sure what a nurse educator does. This is what our nurse educators do on a regular basis, and it's a partial list. Over my experience, I found that many of those people get so excited about education, they go on and do other things. Maura Sullivan, who's now the Vice Chair of Education at USC and is a national leader in surgical education, started her career as a nurse educator for me at USC before she said, I like this stuff, I think I want to do more. So it's a great opportunity. Now Lindsay came in the other day and told me she also is enrolling in a PhD degree. So we want to keep them around once they get their PhD. Vital behaviors for change. This is really important. You need to focus on those key behaviors rather than desired outcomes. So we could have said, yes, our goal is to become number 1 in 3 years. And we did, but that's not enough. It's the idea of buy skim milk when you go to the supermarket rather than you should lose weight. And so it's a way of affecting the path. You're shrinking the change when you are very clear on what behaviors you're looking for. So David Rogers helped with this immensely as clerkship director at Southern Illinois University. And he came to me one day and he said, we need to describe to our faculty what we're looking for as to how they treat medical students and residents. Something simple they will understand. And this is what he told me. We treat residents like our children. We love them. We think about them. There is some discipline involved. We treat medical students like guests in our home. Now, what are the house rules for guests? Well, there are a few rules. There are no chores for guests. Think of those implications. They come and go. We're engaging when they're there, and we think about them when they're gone, and we always put our best foot forward. This was not the typical way students were being treated at some of the clerkships I've directed over the years. So that's how we think about that. A few months ago, Jen Choi, after we got to know each other, that would be my program director, who is a master's degree student with Bridget at UIC, she came in and she said, Gary, I hear what you say about these vital behaviors, but I don't like them. Would you consider an alternative? And she said this: we treat residents like Division I athletes. Well, since we had a sports psychologist on our staff, that made a lot of sense. And she said we treat medical students like a team of recreational soccer players. Now, those of you that have coached kids in soccer, what's the number one thing that determines a successful coach? Everybody got involved. Even if it's a mass just moving from one end of the field to the other, if you remember. That's one of the key criteria of highly ranked clerkships. I felt like I was part of the team. That absolutely has to be part. So I want that to ring in our faculty's mind when they look up and see a medical student come into the operating room. Make sure they leave knowing they're part of the team. Well, it was a 3-year venture, but my clerkship staff came in one day and said, we're really proud to announce that the class of 2016 has announced that the Department of Surgery has won the Outstanding Clerkship of the Year award in 2016. So now the problem is staying there. We've been number 1 every year. We slipped to number 2. There was a lot of grieving and internal reflection when we did that. So we're back on top again. So it's a major goal of our department. But I think, again, it indicates culture. It doesn't happen without a big investment in the people that work for you. You have to train the teachers. We make no assumptions about the people that join us and their skill set. Now, Bridget was right. Every time I look at a new faculty member, I look for 2 things. Will they add value and innovation as a faculty member in our department? And do they have an established record of teaching excellence? I've even been known, if it's not on their CV, to call their chief residents back at their home institution and ask them, what kind of a teacher is this individual? We're not interested in recruiting any faculty that aren't at that high level, but we spend a lot of time training them. Laura Torbeck, who's known to several in the audience, is our PhD Vice Chair of Professional Development and Diversity. Laura spends all of her time improving the skills of all of our staff. So it's not just new faculty series for 10 new faculty this fall. We do a Leaders Growing Leaders that I direct, peer coaching for teaching performance, new faculty. She does courses for APPs, a lot of activities, investing in people. The secret to low turnover is investment in the people that work for you. So she spends a lot of time. She's also now completed coaching to be a certified professional executive coach. This is what the resident professional development programs look like, the usual at the top. And then the residents as teachers, a summer course on research skills, a late summer course on business skills, and life skills for physician wellness. All of those with an individual faculty directing that aspect of the professional development for residents. This came up last night as we were discussing, and I want to just mention my thoughts on motivating faculty to teach. Because I've had a 180-degree turn in my career. So I told you at the beginning, I want you to learn lessons from my failures. So I want you to learn from my failure here. I used to be convinced I could buy people to do anything. If I provided enough carrots, if they were big enough, maybe if I hid the stick, I could pretty much incentivize faculty to do anything. And so at SIU, that's exactly what I did. And as I said last night, this is the only publication in my CV I wish I could retract, because that's not a lot. But it's out there. And so we decided we could pay people to do everything. We had 53 educational activities, research, service. We took 5% of professional receipts and returned it as quarterly incentive bonuses. Those bonuses would be $12,000 to $14,000 for the highest earners every quarter. Everything you can imagine had a credit associated with it. 0.5 credit for evaluating a student H&P. And sometimes faculty would know that's worth $29.50 this quarter. So they were clearly focused on the carrots. Just as I was finishing at SIU, I read the book by Daniel Pink. And I thought, what have I been doing? Actually, carrots don't work. In fact, there's some really deadly flaws of carrots. And as I look back over my previous 15 years there, 12 years as chair, I saw many of these activities demonstrated in a highly incentivized system. At the same time, Deb DeRosa, who had been my research colleague since my first year on the faculty, took me aside at one of the education meetings that happened to be San Diego, and as she called it, did an intervention. And she said, Gary, I know you've had this program for the last 15 years. I've never said anything to you, but I think it's terribly misguided. And I hope when you go to Indiana, you abandon it once and for all. Well, with a lot of input and a book that she gave me and experiences like this, where in Great Britain they tried to increase blood donations by paying for them. And immediately, the numbers plummeted. They were trading what previously had been an altruistic act with money, and it doesn't work out well. And she handed me this book and she said, if you still feel like your SIU academic incentive program is worthwhile, after you read this book, that's fine. And it really changed my life. Stop beating your people with carrots is the message of this book, but the idea is to find out what motivates them, preferably before they join your faculty. I was so impressed by this book that I spent a time over 3 months and asked every single faculty member to come into my office for a conversation, and I asked them one question. I want to know what motivates you to come to work every day. I wrote down their answers because they were some of the most profound, moving comments, and my only feeling was, I wish I'd asked this earlier. So those of you that are chairs or division chiefs, add this to your questions for your annual review. I guarantee a couple, 3 times you'll say, well, I have them in the wrong position. And I shifted people to new responsibilities once I understood what motivated them. So again, as Jim Collins says, if you get the right people on the bus, the problem of motivation goes away. So in our educational culture, when they sit in front of me for the first interview, and I make clear to them, if you're not passionate about teaching, not okay to do it, if you're not passionate about teaching, this is a terrible opportunity for you. So don't even consider it. And so of those 130 faculty, I've recruited over 70 of them with those kinds of parameters, and it clearly makes a difference in culture when you establish that from the beginning. Well, clearly then, if you're going to put this investment, you have to measure performance. I mean really measure performance. So we review all faculty and resident teaching evaluations every 6 months. It's a large document I get on every resident and every faculty member in the program. And we send out notes, and we identify the low-lying and the high-lying faculty. Those are identified for coaching by Dr. Torbeck. Teaching performance is addressed in annual reviews, and all faculty are ranked. This might not work in pediatrics, but it works in surgery. Faculty just don't like to be number 46 out of 48 faculty, and they respond appropriately in most cases. But for those of you that are education leaders, I don't want you to lose the value of informal performance evaluation. I probably learn more about my faculty during my resident dinners. We do 2 or 3 a year with the levels of residents. It's the program director and myself, one's coming up in a few days. And over a glass of wine or a beer, they suddenly become more willing to tell me about their experiences, and I ask them questions. And often I find things that never came through in their formal evaluation, so don't miss the opportunity to get your residents and medical students in your home for a lot of reasons, but including this one. Now we identify bright spots. This is right out of the change literature, and it works phenomenally well. And so Peter Bregman years ago said, you want to change the culture? Find people in your organization doing story-worthy things that represent the culture you're trying to create and tell their story over and over and over again. That's what shining a bright light really is all about. This research study from the University of Illinois, they took a simple problem. How do you make kids like vegetables? Well, those of you who are parents know that the SIU academic incentive program format doesn't work. We'll give you ice cream if you eat. Or let's tell you about the nutritional value of vegetables. None of that works. So in this study, what they did was put at the table another kid who loved vegetables and would eat everything in sight. And all of those kids learned to like vegetables. Now there's real life experiences as well. Jimmy Carter, when he went to sub-Saharan Africa with the problem of guinea worm, they first looked for vital behaviors, or as he described it, positive deviance. And what they found is some of the ladies, after getting this contaminated water and taking it back to their village, took a piece of clothing, put it over another pot, and poured the water through that clothing, thus filtering out the contaminating larvae. Those villages had no guinea worm. That's the vital behavior. Not you must do this. Look at what these folks are doing, and nobody has guinea worm in this village. So that's what we're talking about with this concept. And basically, using that simple change theory, they wiped out guinea worm for the most part in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, this is how we do it. So several months ago, my program coordinator, who's one of the most valuable people in the entire Department of Surgery, said, we're having problems with simple compliance. I have an idea. And she always comes with a problem and a solution, and seldom is it the wrong solution. She said, I want to just plaster everywhere the leaderboard for how many simples are completed. So residents who complete simples of operating performance evaluation and faculty. Everywhere I look now, grand rounds, on the wall, monitors, emails that are sent out regularly. Everybody knows who's leading in all of these areas. And then she said, if you don't mind, I have one other idea. I want a one-year academic challenge to do 10,000 simples in 1 year. But if they reach certain landmark goals, will you participate? And I didn't know exactly what she was referring to. But if they had 8,000 simples this year, the residents get to throw a pie in the face of Brianne, the coordinator. But as you can see at the top is my picture. So if they get 10,000, in front of the Grand Rounds audience, residents will throw a pie in my face. So as you imagine, I'm hoping we get about 9,800. But it takes things like this, and you can't imagine how immediately our simple compliance dramatically improves. It doesn't require a lot of sophistication sometimes. It just requires shining a bright light. The next is coaching the outliers. Of everything I've said so far, this is the tough part. As a new coach myself, I love skill building coaching. New leaders, new department chairs. But when another department chair calls and says, I've got a faculty I'm having a lot of problem with, would you mind coaching them? That's not so exciting, the performance improvement. But as a department chair, the only thing worse than doing it is not doing it. So in our program, there's some pretty clear signs that it's time for some coaching. Here's the most common in our program. Poor clinic teaching using residents and students as workforce. That'll trigger a coaching session. Failure to engage learners in the OR. They're nice, they just don't include them. Student mistreatment was a big issue with our recent LCME visit, and I understand you have one coming up. And then sometimes just ignoring students. Didn't treat them like recreational soccer players. And so there's a 3-step peer coaching program that Laura does. It's first a meeting in their office, reviewing their evaluations, getting their perspective, what they think the problem is. And then she will go to their operating room or their clinic and watch them for 2 to 3 hours. We've developed a pretty sophisticated instrument that takes the best of the world's literature on teaching in the OR, and she fills that out as she watches them teach, and then sits down at the end for a post-coaching debriefing. We have yet to have a faculty member that didn't come back up to the bar with this sort of intense coaching. So the vice chair and myself and the clerkship director identify who we think those outliers are each 6 months for targeted coaching. Now, not everyone responds. And Andy Dunn said the most important people to the culture are those who lead. And in all honesty and transparency, I will tell you that over my 7.5 years at IU, we've had 8 faculty that despite aggressive performance improvement coaching and plans, were not willing to meet the bar. And we had to move them on to different locations, most into community practice. And I think you have to be true to that if you're really going to expect people to meet the bar. I think I would say about this whole scheme is you have to make it easy to do the right thing. That's shrinking the change, guiding the path. This is really a very prominent issue in current literature. You may remember Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for what's become known as behavioral economics. This book is all about behavioral economics. How you create the default move to be the right thing. There is so much to be learned in education about behavioral economics. I'll give you one example from literature. At Kaiser Permanente in California, they were noticing an unacceptably high error rate when nurses were passing out medications on the wards. When they observed it, it was pretty clear why. Residents and faculty were constantly interrupting them, and that's what caused the errors. So they said, let's put these bright orange fluorescent vests over every nurse as they give medication. In the first year, the medication errors dropped 48%. That's making it easy to do the right thing. So again, I kept saying to the leadership of Simple at the board level, you know, there's some things you could do that would really cause faculty and residents to use this instrument, but if you don't, they're not incentivized to do so. And finally, they had an option concern. Finally, here's what they did. They linked it with the ACGME case logs. Our residents kept saying, I don't want to go to all the trouble of identifying specifically what case we did in the OR. Then I still have to go over and do the same thing for the case logs. So we said for a number of months, if you make it one move, they'll start doing it. This was the biggest factor in resident compliance. Then they said, well, we don't see the data in milestones committee. We're not capturing the verbal dictation. So as part of Simple, you push a red button, and you give about 30 to 40 seconds of feedback. So for example, I would give specific feedback. The next time we do an axillary dissection in the operating room, I want you to be much more mindful of nerve anatomy and how you get to the nerves. So very specific feedback. We weren't capturing that. The new system captures that and it goes into milestones. So by doing the things like this, we make it easier for faculty to do the right thing. We had another problem. We had what's called cameos. I don't know what you use to assess performance in the clinic on patient evaluation and workup. I think the board only requires 2 currently. We developed Cameo at SIU, but our faculty said it's just too difficult. I can't remember to do it when I get back at the office and I can't find the forms. So again, our program coordinator said, let's eliminate their excuses. So on the back of every resident ID badge, she puts this little finder. And now they have no excuse. They just scan it, and there's the form right there in clinic. So again, finding ways to make it easy to do the right thing. And this has largely eliminated our struggle of completion of candidates. Well, how will you know it's accomplished? As many of you know, when Jim Collins wrote the book Good to Great, which is just one of the best books ever written on leadership, they said, that's great for businesses, but what about social sectors, NGOs, academics, education? So he wrote a follow-up book, and he talked about these things, which are more qualitative, less quantitative. So I asked the very famous director of the Cleveland Orchestra, how do you know your orchestra is getting better? And he said, well, some things are obvious, like ticket demand and number of standing ovations and how many times we're invited to prestigious festivals and how many others copy our format and growth of endowment. But then he said there's an unusual one. He said, how many times do our cab drivers say, we're really proud of our orchestra? So not quite as quantitative as some things, but there are a lot of those things you can determine in cultures as to what it is in the parts of surgery. Here's some of the things I look at. You have to really twist arms of faculty to get them to participate in the skills lab. Or you have folks calling and saying, I'm feeling left out. Could I participate in the skills lab? That's the desired outcome. Student and resident evaluation, resident morale. The one time I measure this is the social event the night before recruitment day. We don't mandate that our residents come, but we want to know how many feel so invested in the program, they want to be there and interact with the recruits and the intern applicants. That's a huge metric. Imminent conference engagement. Are your faculty there? Are they involved? Or do they schedule cases in the operating room and skip the conference? Program evaluation is really important, and departmental awards. We were talking last night about this event, and so at our annual surgical education grand round, that's when we invite the dean and give all of the teaching awards for residents and faculty, making it a very high event of great importance. But why it fails, you didn't respect the existing culture, and it was there for a reason. Lack of top-down engagement. The end of surgeons as educators, which I taught for 15 years, the participants would have pages and pages of ideas for change when they got back home. One of the questions I always asked them on Friday afternoon before they left, tell me about your chair and your program director. And if it was going to be an uphill battle and not engagement from the top, I warned them, you may need some unique strategies. And you're very fortunate here you have that sort of top-down engagement. I can tell you I visit some programs where it's clearly trying to change culture from the bottom up. You have to have a compelling vision. You focus on outcomes, again, instead of those vital behaviors. And this is the most common reason. Too much, too soon. You're so fired up when you want to change the system overnight. Pace yourself. Change takes a while. If you're not aware of it, when they say, how long does change take in residency training? It's for good reason. The answer is 5 years. That happens to be the length of residency. When we made massive changes in our surgical skills laboratory, the biggest critics, the current chief residents. Not sure why we would ever leave the operating room to go to a skills laboratory. Now it's no longer a problem. Residents can't imagine life without a skills laboratory, but it takes 5 years. And all you do is just continue to change one small increment at a time until you finally reach the tipping point, or as Jim Collins describes it, the flywheel effect. You start accumulating visible results and people get energized and start to line up to participate and you build momentum and then change becomes a way of life. And so that's my recipe for change. And so as we review it, it's learn the culture and raise the bar. Then be careful to set expectations. That sounds like such a simple step, but it sets the basis for everything else, like annual reviews. And then spend a lot of time training the teachers. A PhD educator that you're currently recruiting will be a major help in that regard. Measure performance. Make sure you have reliable measurement across all of your divisions in the Department of Surgery. Identify the bright spots. When someone does something that you're trying to get everyone to do, shine a bright light on them in events like this or department events. And then finally, coach the outliers. Tackle it head on. And at every step of the way, remember behavioral economics. Make it easy to do the right thing. I want to give credit to a group of individuals that I worked back at Indiana University. As I started out in that career I told you about, one of my dreams, and I wasn't sure would ever happen, was to be in an institution where instead of a biological laboratory or a group of geneticists and a research team, I had a group of surgical educators that were entirely devoted to educational research. So every Friday at noon, Dimitri Stefanidis, our vice chair, leads this group of researchers. We have great collaborators at Purdue in bioengineering and human factors, and it's a dynamic group of individuals. This coming year, we'll have 3 fellows, one in our own program for 2 years, a fellow from Louisville, and an international fellow. So it gives some opportunities to do a lot of educational research and grants, etc. So it's really a dynamic team that I work with, and I give them a lot of credit for the things that we're doing. And I'll close with this. I started by encouraging those who were sort of early in their career, first and second and third year faculty, who feel that in many cases you really can't make a difference. And I remind you that John Maxwell was very clear when he said, it's not about position, it's about passion. And if this is something you're passionate about, and follow these simple principles, you will make changes. And for those of you who continue to think, I'm just too small to make a difference, I always remember what the Dalai Lama said. If you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending a night sleeping with a mosquito, and forever you will realize maybe you're not. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennington. That was wonderful. If anyone has one burning question from the audience, I would love to take that. Dr. Colonna?
Thank you for the talk, Dr. Bennington. I had the pleasure of working with you at the Surgeons and Medical Affairs course a couple of years ago, and heard you speak multiple times. It's always a pleasure. My question relates to what are we measuring as our outcome for all these educational changes? Because the pieces of the literature, which obviously we're familiar with, simulation works, team training works. What's the outcome? Are our surgeons attracting more people with surgery? Are our surgeons having less complications? Are they getting sued less? Are we getting better at training people with all this work that we're doing? Or are we not quite there yet? Because the Hallstedian model, obviously, is still the default.
Yeah. I lose track of the number of times I've been asked that over the years, and it's an important one. I think prior to recently, we didn't have a global gestalt of how we're doing better in surgical education with all these interventions. I think moving toward competency-based training, we finally have a measurement that is very clear as to whether we're reaching the goals. So I think what we'll find is that we're able to train residents in less time to levels of competency. In the past, it was 5 years regardless. So I don't think we have that golden measurement that says all of these interventions are making a difference. Now, we clearly know that skills training makes for less errors and shorter time in the operating room. That data is very clear. So that's worth the investment and has great return on investment. A lot of these other things we're in the process of proving. We're doing a lot of research to prove that mental skills training really improves performance in the operating room. Taken as an aggregate, I think we're making a big difference.
Yeah, John?
Do you have any data with regards to resident or physician burnout and how this may impact that in a more positive way? I mean, how does this impact the general well-being of the trainees as they do the program, their perceptions of their training? I think many of us can look back at our time in training and it wasn't a great time in our life. And thinking about changing that culture, making it more positive, direct, and how that may impact wellness as they approach their careers. Do you have any emphasis on that?
Well, again, it's hard to get quantitative data, but as you look at these qualitative metrics of improvement with overall resident morale and the way they interact with applicants to the program, I'm always encouraged when I interview the applicants the next day and they said, I was sold on the program from the social interaction the night before. I think that's a pretty good metric of their overall well-being, but it's a constant effort with all of these various programs to find out what works and what doesn't work. We're going to learn a lot from this national study on interventions for well-being. In the past, we've just been trial and error. We'll now have some concrete data as to whether we're really affecting well-being. And I have the same concern you do. Sometimes we measure it too often. In our program, every 6 months, all the faculty get a form that says, go online and measure your well-being. They have less well-being because they're being asked about it so many times. So we have to be careful about about some of the interventions that people have gotten a little crazy about that.
All right, last question, Dr. Bronson.
I was wondering, for the competency model, I know you said you haven't switched to that, obviously for decreasing length of residency, but do you have any concerns about teaching towards the test or something like that? There's something to be said for having a full 5 to 7 years of training and having more comfort level with the unexpected.
No, I'm not worried about that. I'm not expecting that all of our residents will suddenly start finishing in 2.5 years. To be quite honest, I think it'll still be about 5 years. There's a lot to learn. But I hope that in 5 years we're producing a resident that has a higher level of competence. There's no question we still subscribe to the idea of overtraining. That's really what allows for more excellence in the operating room. So even as we look at skills laboratory and virtual reality, we're focused on not just meeting the bar. We want to overtrain so that you have that attentional capacity availability in the operating room to handle things when they don't go well. So we're spending a lot of time talking about that very issue. Important question.
All right, we'll wrap up in the respective time with M&M for the general surgery resident. Thanks everyone for your patience with the AV hiccups today and moving locations. Appreciated.